Hello, welcome to J. Wallatullah Wood Burning. Today I'm going to try to explain how to wood burn a black bear face. Um, First of all, I cannot talk much when I'm actually wood burning, so this is a voiceover, and the video recording is at double speed. It took me about 2.5 hours to do this. So the video is about an hour long at twice the actual speed. Typically, when I am doing any wood burning of wildlife or any drawing of wildlife, I start with the eyes. The eyes tend to be the focal point, and when I'm working on artwork, I tend to start with the focal point. So here you can see I'm starting with the eyes, and I outline the outer part of the eye, and then I do the pupil. I do leave a little white area for the reflection of the sunlight in the eye. Then I shade in around the iris of the eye. Um, I'm working with a Coalwood Super Pro 2 wood burner, and I'm using the drawing tip pen. The drawing tip pen is shaped kind of like a butter knife. This is one of the tips that, for the pen tip, that I like using the most because it's highly versatile. I can get a very thin, straight line for doing the outline of the eye, or I can use it kind of like a butter knife to spread butter. I can use it along the flatter surface in order to get a more even shading. And I start with the eyes because if I mess up on the focal point, then I can start over very quickly, as opposed to if I do all of the fur and background shading first and then I mess up on the eyes at the very end, or the focal point at the very end, then I've put a lot more work into the entire piece to mess up on the focal part at the very end. So it's a time saver for me to work from the focal point outward, and that way if I do mess up, I can just start over very quickly. When you're working with, say, the fur around the edge of the face, if you mess up, it's not as noticeable, in my opinion. So that's kind of the reasoning behind why I start with the eyes. Here you can see I'm shading in the iris. Typically, the upper eyelid will cast a bit of a shadow, so I typically go very, very dark right underneath the upper eyelid and then fade out into the iris. And I've got my coffee. Another thing to note on this video is I inverted the image just due to the fact that I'm recording off my computer and it's hard to have my computer right in front of me and then do the wood burning in front of the computer. So I have the computer sitting up a little bit, and then the wood burning in front of me and the computer facing downward toward the wood burning. That way the computer's out of my way for working, and you get a clear image of what I'm doing without my arms in the way. But the image is inverted, So that shouldn't make much of a difference for you viewing. I inverted it partly that way you can watch from having it look right side up to you. Once I finish the actual eyes, I start with the fur around the eyes and work my way out from there. And you can see the reference photo I'm working with. This is actually a gift for a friend of mine, so I let him pick out the reference pictures. When I'm working for myself or to put things out for sale, I try to be very, very careful about copyright issues. I try to make sure I have permission from the photographers if I'm working with local people, or if I'm looking up images online, make sure that it's a Creative Commons use image. You can use Google Images, and then under the tools, you can do a filter for Creative Commons to find copyright-free, basically, images that you can work from. On the lower eyelid, there is some reflection from the sun, so I burnt lighter just under the lower eyelid to mimic that reflection on the fur from the sun. And then working down from the corner of the eye here, the fur is very, very fine, so I'm using the like flat edge of the drawing tip to pull out the shading so that I'm not getting distinct lines, and that creates a very even shading to mimic the very fine fur right around the eye going down toward the nose. Up above where the eyebrow is, the fur is longer, so I'm using the drawing tip more like a knife to get more lines indicating the individual pieces of fur. And I like to work back and forth. It helps create texture with the fur being different lengths and being able to blend it in together. So I got a little bit of the fur around one eye, and then I'm going to come back over here and work around the other eye to kind of balance it out as I'm working from both focal points, both eyes. I'll do a little bit of work around one, then go back to the other, do a little bit of work around that one. Same principles here. There's a bit more shadow right where the eyes come together, or in between the eyes there. And so I don't adjust the temperature control very often on my wood burner. Right now I have it set to just a little bit over 5 on the temperature control. I'm using the detailed side of the Super Pro 2 for the Coalwood. And I adjust how dark I burn based on the speed at which I move the tip across the wood. If I want a slightly darker burn, I move the tip slower, allowing more heat to transfer from the wood burning tip to the wood. And if I want it slightly lighter, I move the tip of the wood burner faster across the wood. That way not as much heat gets transferred. understanding your subject matter helps a lot when you're trying to depict it. I've had the privilege of working around bears off and on throughout my life, working up close with them, and so I have a fairly good feel with how their fur is, how they move, how they look, and how they act. But when you're doing this, you want to always keep the rhythm of your strokes with the wood burner in the same direction as the fur would flow. So, using an example that most people will be able to relate to a little bit better than bears, if you have a dog or a cat, the fur goes in a direction, usually from head to tail. And so when you're trying to depict that, you want to have the lines for the fur go in the same direction as the fur would go. Fairly straightforward. But paying attention to that around the eyes, seeing that the fur goes up a little bit more over the eyebrows and curves back down, and following that curve when you're actually trying to depict it, not going against the flow of the hair but going with it, will help create a more realistic picture. Also, the length of the strokes that you do with the wood burner can help mimic the length of the hair. So right around the eyes and going toward the nose, the hair gets significantly shorter. So I'm doing very, very small strokes with the wood burner to mimic the shortness of the hair. And here I'm kind of outlining where the black hair meets the lighter hair on the nose, and then working my way in and filling in along the cheek. But very, very short strokes to mimic the short hair. And as we go out closer to the edge of the cheek, the strokes get slightly longer because it's got longer hair. And when you're doing this, you want to think kind of in reverse. So what you're actually doing is you're filling in the shadows between the hairs, and some of the hairs will be left highlighted where they have more sunlight hitting them. That helps create contours and contrast. But you always want to think of things in terms of light and dark, and you're filling in where it's darkest and then going lighter and lighter and lighter. It's very, very difficult to correct for a mistake in wood burning. You typically just have to sand off the area that you made a mistake on, and that creates a slight difference in the wood surface. So as an artist, I can tell if I make a mistake and had to sand off, and I don't like that. I don't know if, the average person would be able to tell, but I can tell and I don't like it. So I typically, if I make a mistake, I start over. I try to avoid sanding off an area of a wood burning and redoing it, just because I don't like how it ends up. Also, I kind of don't believe in mistakes. I believe that everything is a learning process, and no matter how it turns out good, because I got to practice, I got to learn, and that to me is satisfactory. So I typically, even if I don't like the finished product, or if I did something I did not intend to, I will still typically finish up the piece, and then if I'm not 100% satisfied, I'll do it again, because practice is the way that you improve. And by keeping pieces that I may have made mistakes on, I can see how I'm growing and learning through this trade. So the third part of the focal point of this piece is the nose. And instead of working my way all the way down through the fur on the cheeks, I jumped down a little bit to the nose to try to get this part of the focal point correct, and then I'll go back and fill in more of the fur. Noses tend to be very, very difficult because we have a preconceived notion of what they should look like, and that's rarely what they really look like. My best advice to you is do exactly what you see. Even if it doesn't quite make sense in your head why there should be a shadow here or why there should be a highlight there, trying to reproduce an image accurately, following exactly what you see, is the key part there. You can also see that I sketched out the image in pencil before I started the wood burning. I do everything freehand because I enjoy that the best. There's no right or wrong to any of this. There's a variety of ways that you can transfer the image, using graphite paper or carbon paper. You can trace it. There's no right or wrong. Do what makes you happy. Having fun with it is paramount to all of this. If you're not having fun with it, then you're not going to stick with it. So have fun with your wood burning. Don't worry about what people say is right or wrong, unless it involves copyright issues and legal issues. But as far as your techniques go, do what you enjoy. So with the nose, the hair around it is very, very short and blends down to quite dark fairly quickly. But I think at this point I've got most of the three main focal points complete. The eyes and the nose. And you can see I left a reflection from the sun off the bridge of the nose. And I should also note, this is on bird's eye maple. There's two separate boards here. You can see the seam through the middle of the face. The actual finished product that I'm working on, this is only one small portion of the entire drawing, and there's other animals in a collage around it. And I'm working on multiple boards here. Maple as a type of wood tends to be fairly light in color, and it burns quite well. You can get very, very high detail with maple and very crisp, sharp edges, but it does take longer. Basswood is another very light wood that burns very well for doing pyrography. Basswood burns faster than maple. And there's, again, no right or wrong. What type of wood you use, that's completely up to you. You'll get used to different types as you practice. So here I'm doing the fur around the nose and on the bridge of the nose. And this fur is very light and very short, so I'm doing it quite quickly. Still, I have the wood burner set at just a hair over the 5 on a scale of 0 to 10. And I'm using the detailed side of the wood burner. And bringing the fur down from the eyes to the nose. Trying to follow the flow of the fur as it changes. On the bridge of the nose, the fur is basically going straight up and down, and then it curves around as it follows the contours of the nose. Also trying to get layering with the fur, so working kind of in rows that curve around the nose so that you get a layering effect of fur, but not specifically in lines. I try to blend them in because fur doesn't grow in lines, neither does hair. So trying to blend them in but still create layering. As I work my way up toward the forehead, the fur does get longer and darker, but on the forehead, there's also more reflection against the sun. And so I'm using longer strokes for individual lines for the fur. And I'm going a little bit darker, but remember, I'm doing this in reverse. So the parts that are left light are the fur on the outer part of the forehead that are reflecting the sun, and I'm actually filling in the shadow in between the fur. Or the deeper part of the fur. And coming back down to the mouth area. The fur is very, very short here. And here again, I'm working a little bit more towards like using the tip, the drawing tip, as a butter knife to spread butter, where I'm doing more of an even shading here, because it's more in shadow. And then I'll go back through and do little tiny lines to add texture, but doing the even shadow by pulling across and doing an even shading burn, and then going back over it with like a slicing motion with the tip to create a little bit more texture in that shadow. Very, very light burn over here. This is the brightest part of the picture. On the left-hand side of the nose, where the sun is hitting the bridge of the nose, and then going back down into shadow. There is a little bit of reflection on the lower lip, so I left that unburnt, to signify where the lower lip is. And then shading quite dark. Again, I have not changed the setting on the wood burner. I'm just going much slower, allowing more time for the heat to transfer over to the wood. And it's actually starting to look like an animal of some sort. Here I'm kind of filling in the dark areas below the chin. And I'm going fairly slow and carefully because I'm actually leaving a few like whisker hairs that um, are kind of highlighted. So I'm burning around some of the little hairs on the whisker that poke out. Some people will use a tool to actually scrape or dig into the wood to create light hairs on animals like this. I prefer not to do that just because I like a really smooth surface on the wood when I'm done. So I burn around hairs and whiskers like that. But again, there's no right or wrong. Do what you enjoy, do what works for you. Very, very small strokes again. The hair is very fine around the face here. And I come back in and say, okay, this could use a little bit more shading. And the sunlight's coming from the upper left-hand side, so the lower right-hand side is going to be a little bit more in shadow. Another thing to note is that I foreshortened the forehead on the bear. So I did that on purpose because I have a specific size and shape that I want to fill with this picture in the collage of other animals around it. So I purposely foreshortened the forehead, and I hope it'll turn out all right. It's a little bit tricky when you're doing things like that because you want to get your angles correct and you want it to look good at the end. So having things proportional if you're trying to be very accurate and have it very realistic is important, but I did foreshorten the forehead of the bear. So I think I've got the focal points down at this point. Now it's basically filling in a lot of fur. And when you're filling in the fur, you want to pay attention to lights and shadows and try to follow the overall flow of the picture you're working from. And there's a darker area here that I'm filling in, kind of shadow where the fur curves downward around the eyes or below the eyes. So I filled in that kind of U-shaped or crescent below the eye on both sides, and then I come back and work my way back up toward the eye where there's a little bit of a highlight. But filling in the darker area like that on the fur helps me judge how light I should go around it. When you're starting out with drawing, a lot of times people don't go very dark, and that's something I struggle with quite often too. Number one, it takes a lot longer. Number two, it's harder to correct if you make a mistake. And so it's basically an act of being timid to not go very dark. and it takes a lot of practice and a lot of pushing myself to try to go extremely dark on any of my artwork, whether it's pen and ink or pencil or wood burning. I tend to have I tend to worry about going too dark, and then I end up going too light. So this is one of those things where, okay, there is a darker shadow under the eye for the curvature of the fur, and I try to fill that in extremely dark and then go back up to light to try to push myself to make it more realistic and push myself to make it darker. Which in the end creates more contrast, makes a starker image, makes it stand out better when you're viewing it across to the room. But it is something I struggle with, and I think a lot of people struggle with, to get things as dark as they really should be. But it's starting to look like a bear. Here, trying to get the texture of the fur is getting longer and has more highlights, and but that doesn't mean that I should go lighter altogether. It has more highlights and more contrast. So trying to draw in or burn in where the shadows are, and then go back through and create the texture of the fur. Also looking closely at the picture, the reference photo, to try to figure out where the fur bends, to follow the flow of the natural curvature of the fur around the face, around like the eyebrows and up the forehead, to have a smooth transition from going straight up to curving around back. So I'm basically trying to shade in above where the eyebrow is, because it's slightly darker there, and then work my way back into where the actual eyebrow is and fill it in slightly lighter. Fur can be difficult. It takes practice. When I started, I did not do the individual pieces of fur. I just did shading, um, which is much faster but less detailed. And as I practiced more and more, I started doing more individual pieces of hair, for however you want to say it. Um, Another thing I'll note is when I'm actually doing the wood burning, I don't talk. Talking language uses the opposite side of your brain as the visual centers and doing artwork. And one of the fun facts I learned in high school art class is that it takes about 45 minutes of doing artwork without speaking for your brain to fully engage in that center of being able to do artwork well. So typically, I will do a little warm-up wood burning or sketch or some form of artwork that's a warm-up piece before I sit down to do a high detailed burn like this. Therefore, this picture of a bear took a little over 2 hours, about 2.5 hours, and before I even started, I worked for about 45 minutes on a warm-up piece just to get my mind in the right place to do something high detailed in a quiet setting where I don't have any distractions, I don't have anybody to talk to, um, so that my mind is very focused on what I'm doing. And that's something that's probably difficult for a lot of people to get quiet time for 45 minutes at all, let alone for 45 minutes just to warm up before you really begin